The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll look at why Indigenous groups oppose the Ontario government's Bill 5. Then we sit down with the Agenda's first ever guest from 19 years ago, Conrad Black. That's ahead on the Agenda.
The Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, better known as Bill 5, is the province's answer to the red tape it says is holding back major infrastructure, mining, and resource development projects such as the Ring of Fire. The bill has sparked major opposition from Indigenous leaders who say it circumvents the government's duty to consult First Nations. Here with us now to give us a better take on Bill 5 and its implications, we welcome on the line from Moose Cree First Nation, Chief Peter Wesley. And with us in studio, Kate Kempton, Senior Counsel at Woodward and Company Lawyers, LLP, an Indigenous rights lawyer. And Zachary Davis, partner with Pape Salter Teye, LLP, specializing in Indigenous rights law. Welcome to you both in studio, and Chief for joining us on the line. Kate, I'm coming to you first. Bill 5 is technically called Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act. What do you think its mission is?
I think its mission is to do what Trump is doing south of the border, which is anti-democratic and anti-First Nations and environmental rights. I think it's designed to vest a bunch of power in the executive to make politically based decisions that are not grounded in law or rights or their obligations legally or in science. And I think across the board, the entirety of Bill 5 is a breach of the rule of law, the Constitution, and the entirety, I don't see anything good in it at all. And I think it's designed to be anti-democratic and to allow the Ford government to push on ahead to make a bunch of money now for itself and its developer buddies, and push the cost forward of environmental devastation and human rights devastations to future governments and future generations who will be so harmed by what we're doing that they may not be able to cover those costs.
Zachary, I'll get your take.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. You know, what it does technically is empower the provincial government to create these special economic zones or special economic people, so-called trusted proponents, that they could exempt from the application of any law in the province. And this isn't just environmental assessment. This could be the Human Rights Code. This could be basic labor laws. And we don't know what criteria they would use because they will design those themselves. We don't know for what purposes they could do this because they will design those criteria themselves in regulation. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about mining, but it could be used for any project of any size anywhere in the province, or for any proponent of any size anywhere in the province. So it really is a ragging of legislative authority towards the executive.
All right, Chief, I want to get your thoughts, maybe not on the potential impacts here, but the purpose of the bill, as the way that the provincial government is setting it out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for Moose Cree, we share a lot of the sentiments that are being expressed by other First Nations against this bill. Like, to us, it's they say they're cutting red tape, but for us, our treaties are not red tape. You just can't do away with that. It's just not acceptable, and they even put in references in the amendments that were proposed. That's not sufficient. We need greater clarity on just exactly how they're going to achieve those in talking with First Nations. Like, we're the ones going to be most impacted, and we need to be part of the process. It's just not acceptable just to come and say we're going to do this and trust us. That doesn't work that way. We simply can't operate on that. Nobody would be able to operate like that.
I actually want to show a map of Ontario highlighting the various nations you both, Kate and Zachary, are representing in relation to the Ring of Fire. You can see Thunder Bay to the south, Moose Cree right there to the border, and the Ring of Fire in red. Zachary, one measure of Bill 5 is to create, as you mentioned, those special economic zones, including the Ring of Fire. Legally speaking, though, break down the jargon here. What does that mean?
Right. So I think the first level of concern is we don't know, right? There aren't a lot of details about what the rules would be in a special economic zone because all that the bill says is that the government will come up with them later in regulations. This is particularly concerning with the new language we started to hear last week, that the bill would also provide for Indigenous-led economic zones. Now, I agree we need to acknowledge Indigenous leadership. But beyond that, that is just a string of words. They have provided no details as to what goes into that. Here's the problem. The government of Ontario cannot exempt themselves from the duty to consult. That's a constitutional obligation. Right now, we're not huge fans of the mining regime, but there are a series of decision points in the mining regime. An exploration plan, exploration permits, all the way down to a closure plan and closure permits. And each one of those decision points triggers the duty to consult.
Right.
That's when First Nations engage with the government, share their concerns, there's a potential for negotiation, there's a potential for accommodation. In a special economic zone, those could just be wiped off the table. So First Nations don't know when, how, where, or if they're going to be consulted. And that's the real concern. When Chief Wesley mentioned the amendment last week, that says that the government will respect treaty rights and the duty to consult, but it doesn't say how. So we're just sort of floating in the consultative ether. That's the problem.
All right, lots of question marks there. Kate, Zachary had kind of mentioned some examples. Can you give us a couple of other examples of provincial laws that companies working on these projects can be exempted from?
Yeah, can I just though address something that's already been said? There's a case filed in court now in Ontario that says that First Nations never gave up and the Crown governments, like the Ontario government, never legally acquired the right to take over all decision-making authority or governance rights over the land that comprises Ontario or frankly Canada. That First Nations retain their right to govern not just on their little reserves, but across the land, alongside equally with the Crown governments. That this was guaranteed by treaties. And so when Chief Wesley is talking about treaty rights, we're not just talking about the right to hunt or fish or gather berries. It's the right to a way of life, including the governance of the land on which that life has always been for the Indigenous nations. They've always been here. And so I want to make it clear that what many First Nations, if not all, in Ontario are now saying about Bill 5 is what it's really harming is the right to decide. First Nations' right to decide, which the duty to consult is a part of made up by the Supreme Court of Canada from originally almost 30 years ago. And it started off as a what might have held a promising legal concept. And it said that essentially any Crown government that was going to make any decision at all that would affect a First Nation or its rights needed to consult to the extent that they were substantially addressing that First Nation's concerns, i.e., what will it take to get you to consent to this thing that I, as Crown government, am planning to permit to happen? And it got watered down and whittled away over the last couple of decades by pressures brought to bear on Crown governments and on the courts. But it started off well. It's become a bad thing. The duty to consult now is just a box-ticking exercise. And the Ford government has been particularly bad at ignoring its real intent was to have mutual decision-making. And instead, it's just become an exercise of we're going to take you to the Keg Steakhouse and wine and dine you and say that we've talked to you, and we're going to plow on ahead, literally bulldoze over your lands, and the law lets us, the Canadian law lets us do so because we talked to you first. And that's what it's devolved to in many circles, particularly in Ontario. And that's not what it's ever been about, and First Nations have moved off of that track because of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and its domestication into Canadian law. So it's law here that says that First Nations have the right to decide. And we have to get real about what that means here. And Bill 5 is the straw that is breaking that camel's back. It is the one that after a series of other omnibus bills that the Ontario government has passed over the last 7 or so years that have stripped away environmental protections. And as Zach was saying, decision points around which the government would engage legally with First Nations. If you take away a bunch of decisions because you're not regulating anything at all, you're not issuing any permits, then there's no vehicle, there's no trigger for the duty to engage. And this is the last of a series of those that is just so bad in its degree, and cumulatively it's just, the line in the sand is way over, been crossed. And First Nations are saying, you're not listening to us. The word consult may be used, but what it really means is we have to be mutually there at the table with you. This is our land. You can't, from the ivory tower of Toronto, be making decisions without us at the table, being there, making those decisions with you. That is really what is going on. The right to decide is at issue here, and Bill 5 crushes it entirely.
Chief, I am curious, Kate had mentioned if not all First Nations are on board with kind of fighting back and pushing back Bill 5, but I am curious, how do you balance or strike that balance with some nations that might be looking forward to something like this, looking forward to potentially getting, roads and some infrastructure in the area?
I would start by saying I'd be very cautious on proceeding, given that this bill is it's being debated and eventually a decision will be made down the road. I want to give an example of how Moose Cree, where we are. Like we started a co-planning process on a project, a potential hydro development project within our territory with another First Nation in our area, and to the point where on I believe it was April 9th, we stood shoulder to shoulder with Minister Lecce, and we made a joint announcement on how we were going to work together in developing a potential hydro development site. And unknowns to us, a few days later, Bill 5 was announced. And that just, we thought we were, that would have been a perfect example on how to engage First Nations, work together collaboratively on determining, at the end of the day, the First Nation would be able to support it. But now, given Bill 5, we have to revisit this. I don't know. It's concerning. And if other First Nations are in support of this, I would express caution to them. There's no details. We don't know what the details are, and you say the devil's in the details. So until we know the details, I'd be cautious in supporting it.
All right, I'm going to read a statement from the Government of Ontario. This is via email. They wrote, "We are upholding high environmental standards, labor laws, and duty to consult, and have introduced amendments to the legislation to be very clear about that. There is no provision in the bill that would allow for laws to be circumvented, nor would legislation ever be used to change that. Any suggestion otherwise is false. We will work throughout the summer in consultation with Indigenous partners to develop regulations to create a new special economic zone and Indigenous-led economic zones as part of Bill 5. This amendment, creating a new category of zone, is at the request of some First Nations who, like us, want to build projects that will unlock economic prosperity for generations." Chief, I'm going to get your thoughts on that statement first, and then I would like to get your, we'll go around the block there. Chief?
I think it's a little too late. We should have been there at the very beginning. I think they're scrambling now, to be honest, just to try to meet their obligations that they should have done in the first place. And I'd go even further to say it affects the Ontario public as well, not only First Nations, and because it has the potential, the public of Ontario will remember the Greenbelt fiasco. Right. And this act would actually give the power to the Premier to do that again if he so pleases. So it's not only about First Nations. I think the public of Ontario needs to be aware of this as well. And a lot of other organizations are against this bill, given the overreaching authority it's trying to achieve.
Zachary, I'll get your thoughts. You also had mentioned, the Indigenous-led economic zones. I want to get your thoughts on there, but also understanding what do you take that to mean?
Yeah, I would say two things in response to that statement. First of all, the Government of Ontario's insistence that their approach here respects the duty to consult rings very hollow. Here's one example. Ontario has what's called a free entry mining regime, which allows prospectors to stake claims without any consultation, and by staking those claims, they acquire exclusive rights. That's a regime that is found to violate the duty to consult and be unconstitutional in 2 provinces in a territory. This was an opportunity for the province to fix that regime and demonstrate to First Nations that they believed in the duty to consult, they would respect their rights, and they would work with them as partners. They didn't do that. Instead of correcting that known problem, they are repealing other existing safeguards. So that's number one. It's really hard to believe the province when they say they'll respect the duty to consult. Number 2, I really take issue with the with us and against us rhetoric coming out of the provincial government. I think we need to distinguish between First Nations that are against Bill 5 and First Nations that are against development. They're not the same groups of people. Lots of First Nations are pro-development, but they want to do it in partnership. Right. They're cautious about the consequences of development. The Ring of Fire is a great example. The First Nations we work up for there are pro-roads. They want an all-season road. It will improve their life. But they're conscious that it will come with other dangers, drugs. It will come with the potential for more missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they want to make sure that that change to their lifestyle is carefully considered and done in a way that's collaborative. So when Doug Ford says there is only one way to do development, and that is Bill 5, I think he's absolutely wrong. And I think Chief Wesley raised a really good example of how to do it right, which they did only a week before they announced this. So it's really a case of pulling the rug out from under.
All right. Kate, on Monday, Justice Minister Sean Fraser said the federal government's duty to consult Indigenous people on the development of nation-building projects does not grant those communities blanket veto power. I'm going to assume you do not agree with that statement, but give me your thoughts on that.
Let's talk about propaganda. The Captain Canada, after Trump was elected and announced tariffs, has turned around and, as Tanya Talaga correctly pointed out in an article or op-ed in the Globe and Mail, did exactly the same thing as Trump has done and has been opportunist in terms of using tariffs as an excuse. I mean, most of the development that could occur that the Ford government is saying we need to do to address tariffs won't commence into operation until Trump is long gone in a distant memory. And so it's propaganda. It's building on fears of people. And by the same token, the Ford government is, I think it's frankly immoral and illegal behavior to feed on the fears of First Nations based on a couple of centuries of colonialism and the impoverishment that has caused. I mean, many First Nations, their members live in abject poverty to the extent that most Ontarians will never see or experience, and sort of dangling the carrot, preying on that vulnerability that comes with impoverishment to say, oh, but we'll give you your own money, effectively. It's dangling the possibility of money from having some economic development. Why do First Nations have to choose between the right of self-determination to make decisions about the territory from which they have always been and which they've always governed? There's no non-Indigenous town up in the Ring of Fire area. It's all only ever First Nations. Why should they be forced to choose from the right to decide what happens alongside the government of Ontario with those lands and to the people and animals and plants in and on those lands and economic quality of life that the rest of us take for granted? Why are they being forced to choose? And that's exactly what this dangling of the carrot. Let us, please, if I'm Premier Ford, and this is what Bill 5 is saying, let us go ahead and ruin the landscape, ruin your lands, ruin your rights over here, but we'll throw you a little bit of money for your own, economic zone over there. It's a disgusting. It's disgusting to prey on vulnerability like that. And so, there's some development always occurs on First Nations lands, and some of it occurs with their consent. we're not ever suggesting that some development, that all development is bad and wrong, but it needs to be done considering the consequences, understanding, first of all, what they are, what the impacts may be on people and the rest of the environment, because we're part of it, and then making informed decisions to either prevent or minimize certain consequences or compensate and take other measures to offset them. And the very kind of set of laws he's saying we need to wipe out will avoid understanding consequences and addressing them. And on the last point about the statement that you read to Zach about the duty to consult will be honored, you know, one of the shortcomings of the way that in some circles Canadian law and the duty to consult has been interpreted says it is only triggered if there's a Crown or Ontario like government decision.
Right.
And if you take away all those decision points, then they can still say, well, I'm abiding by Canadian law and the duty to consult by simply having no decisions to consult on. And again, it's trickery, it's propaganda, it's opportunism, and we need to see this for what it is.
All right. I want to play a clip. This is of Marit Stiles in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario earlier this week. Let's have a look.
I do not know how this government can face anyone right now, knowing how you are trampling on the rights of Ontarians. So I would like to know how creating more chaos and more conflict is going to bring economic security to this province.
All right, Zach, I want to get a better understanding. We've heard NDP Deputy Leader Saul Mamakwa predict more chaos and more conflict in Ontario with the passage of this bill. Any idea what that would look like?
Well, first I want to say I think she's absolutely right that this bill gets it wrong in that, you know, what attracts investment? Regulatory certainty. People need to know that they're going to get money back for the money that they put in. And the biggest risk to regulatory uncertainty is if the approvals and permits issued by a government are not legally valid or legally sound. That's how what otherwise could be a productive project ends up in years of litigation. And I think that's exactly where this is headed. If you strip away the rules, the criteria, the framework for how an approval is issued, and just start handing them out in a way that doesn't in any obvious way reflect the rights of First Nations or other constitutional rights, they will be challenged. And you'll have otherwise good projects end up in court.
All right, we have less than a minute left, but I want to get the Chief and Kate's take on this. If there was a message, Chief, to the province, to the provincial government, and they had your ear, what's your message to them?
I would say you need to withdraw Bill 5. It doesn't work for anybody. And, you know, we've prior to Bill 5 coming out, we've reached out to Premier Ford and Minister Rickford to engage with us because we're like that, like it's been stated here, we're not against development. We just want you to work with us in how we want things to be developed within our homeland. And we never received a response. And now they're saying, well, trust us, we'll fill in the details after. No, sorry, that's simply not going to work. You need to work with the First Nations. That's, at the end of the day, you need to work with us. And First Nations are not happy, and they're willing to do whatever, I believe. And I don't think that's a road anybody wants to go down on.
All right, Kate, you get the last word. What message do your communities want to send to the provincial government?
Look out. There will be litigation, and there will be protests, and there may well be blockades, and that's an exercise of Indigenous laws to stop a fundamental wrongdoing. I totally agree with the statement from the NDP representative that all hell is going to break out if this continues on the course that it's on, and a number of First Nations are going to do what they have to do to stop it.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Kate, Zachary, Chief Wesley, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back in 2006, TVO started a new nightly current affairs program called The Agenda. And our first ever guest was Conrad Black, newspaper proprietor, member of the British House of Lords, and prolific author. So we thought it only made sense, 19 years later, as The Agenda winds down, to get back to Black. And here he is, Conrad Black. Welcome back. It's good to see you in that chair.
Stephen. Nice to see you again.
I thought we'd do a bit of a tour d'horizon here of Canada-U.S. relations, Canadian politics, American politics, and because you've had such a fascinating life, maybe a few life lessons along the way. You good to go?
Best is yet to come.
Let's hope so.
Sure.
Why don't we start with what you said to me before we started? And that was just before the cameras were rolling, which is all this nonsense about Donald Trump not liking Canada and having it out for Canada. How do you square that belief of yours with all of his talk about making us the 51st state?
All he ever said about that was the 51st state, which he acknowledges, by the way, to be an underestimation of Canada demographically and otherwise. I suggest that it was gratuitously rude to say we should have the same senatorial representation as the state of Delaware, for instance. It was in response to Justin Trudeau, who said, if you impose these tariffs, the economy will collapse. And him taking notice that we have never in his time or many years before pulled our weight in NATO. He was really saying you'd be better off joining us. I mean, if your economy is that vulnerable and you can't pay for your own defense, you'd be better off joining us. He never said anything about taking Canada over. And I noted that in one of the Globe and Mail's articles about it, a perfectly fine article in all other respects, it used the word annexation 6 times. He never said anything about that. He didn't say, I'm going to take Canada over. He was saying that he thought Canada was in such a state of vulnerability, it would be better off with federal union with the U.S.
Do you agree with that?
No, I think we can make a better country here. But I do agree with him that we haven't governed ourselves well, but neither have they. I mean, if the U.S. had been a well-governed country, Trump wouldn't have been elected president either time.
A federal union with the United States, do you think that makes any sense?
Look, the president himself asked me this, and I said I myself would not vote for it because, frankly, I think we can actually build not a greater country, but a better country here. And I wouldn't want to give that potential up. But if you offered, as Helmut Kohl did to East Germany, par on the currency, I mean, despite all the people waving the maple leaf flag around, a lot of people would take that and would be a nice incentive for them. And if you promised retention of residential control of residential matters, so you didn't have the 20 million worst welfare cases in the U.S. just crossing the border northwards in 2 weeks after a federal union, and also Canada's right to retain its gun rules. It doesn't have that tradition, which is an admirable tradition in some ways, but it leads to a terrible amount of gun violence, of everyone having a right to bear arms. If you did that, you'd get a respectable vote. I don't think you'd win, but you'd make a respectable vote. But you have to stop acting, I said to him, as if it's like admitting Puerto Rico to statehood or something like this. This is a G7 country.
When did you speak to him about this?
Well, he phones me sometimes. So, this particular conversation was about 10 days ago.
10 days ago?
Yeah.
So you still speak?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Frequently?
Well, I don't phone him, no, but he phones me occasionally. I've known him a long time.
What have you told him when he asks, or if he asks, your opinion about all the tariffing he's doing on us these days?
He hasn't put it that way. He's not particularly asked my view on that.
Okay, so I will. What do you think about all the tariffs he's putting on Canada? In terms of whether they make economic sense?
I don't think, and I did tell him this, I don't think that he's treating us fairly. And I think it was particularly outrageous for him to put us in the same sentence as Mexico. I mean, the United States does have a legitimate grievance with Mexico. Mexico, as you know, incentivizes American companies to shut down their factories, incentivizes them to build new factories 5 miles inside the Mexican border, takes parts from China, fabricates them in Mexico, and ships them back at a knockdown price into the U.S. under the trade agreement. Add to that the Mexican government has clearly been colluding in this invasion of the United States, which the former regime tolerated, but has now stopped.
But we don't do that.
That was the point I made, and we don't do any of that, and you shouldn't compare us to Mexico. And he took that point. Look, he's, I'm not an intimate of his, and I have no standing to say that he pays a particularly great amount of attention to my views, but he does ask my opinion sometimes.
As will I over the remaining moments we have.
And I'm flattered, even though the position you hold is slightly less august than his.
19 years ago, you were in this studio, and we talked about whether Canada was meeting the moment. And here's what you had to say. Sheldon, if you would, roll the clip.
Canada is a country that I think has become accustomed to thinking of itself as sort of a middle power and a secondary country. And yet there are 191 members of the United Nations, and Canada is undoubtedly one of the 10 most important countries in the UN. And it isn't a middle power. It's a very important country. And I think we have to act like that.
In the intervening nearly 2 decades, has this country performed on the world stage in a way that you think one of the 10 best countries in the world should have been acting?
In the Harper years, I think it did, and in the Trudeau years, I think it has not. And we'll have to wait and see with the Carney years. But no, it's become a kind of joke in the world as a woke country and a silly country, and one that doesn't pull its weight in the alliance, and is descending the economic ladder. I mean, we're becoming uncompetitive. We have net capital outflows, which is scandalous for a rich country like this. But it's all to play for. I mean, all people and all institutions fluctuate, so we haven't done mortal damage to ourselves. It's still 41 million, well-motivated, talented workforce people in a treasure house of a country with relatively stable political institutions. So it's, as I say, it's all to play for. We just, in my opinion, have not been well governed the last decade.
Do you think?
And I like Justin Trudeau as a person. I just don't think he was a good prime minister.
Do you think what you've seen of Mark Carney so far suggests that he has aims at making this a more serious country on the world stage?
He does. He certainly does. Unfortunately, I part company with him in some policy areas, but I think he's an able man, sincerely motivated to do well for the country, and I wish him success.
You part company with him on what in particular?
He's much too preoccupied with and takes an unsustainable view on climate matters. He's too
got rid of the carbon
socialistic.
tax.
Yeah, having championed it for 20 years, yeah. But, I mean, he can read the polls too, you know. But I would say that. I was on that Davos scene for a long time, just in my area and the media. Indeed, I succeeded the late Bob Maxwell as head of the media section. And it was a useful place for me to go to talk shop with Rupert Murdoch and people like that. But the mentality is a sort of a dirigist mentality, a kind of unelected officials will tell people what's good for them. And I fear that he is a bit affected by that viewpoint because of some things he said. I don't know him personally, so I can't comment on that.
Never met him?
I've met him once. I doubt if he would remember it. No reason why I should, but just to shake hands with.
I'm pretty sure that if Mark Carney met Conrad Black, he'd probably remember that.
Look, he's a perfectly amiable man to see. I mean, politicians usually are.
Do you agree with him that we need a complete revolutionary reset of our relationship with the United States?
A substantial one, yes, I would say that. I mean, look, I think it's complicated. It is so ingrained in this country to be self-conscious about our relations with the U.S. that what we really need to do is emancipate ourselves and be a little more spontaneous. But to do that, we have to become strong in the world. We need a military appropriate to our size as a country and to the role we want to play. We need positive cash flows. We need greater economic growth. We need more swiftly rising per capita income. We're losing ground all the time to states that when I and even you were younger, were behind us. And if we did these things, we would be much more confident, and the relations with the U.S. would, to a large extent, would correct itself. But yes, I mean, what you're, I think, really saying is, should we seek greater access to other markets and things? The answer is yes, but on the other hand, it's a huge advantage to have that colossal market right beside us. But we're not exploiting it properly.
Do you trust Mr. Carney's economic bona fides, given his background, to be the guy to make those kinds of transformative changes to our economy?
I trust his bona fides, but I don't trust his judgment. I thought that he was a catastrophic governor of the Bank of England. He made a complete mockery of the much vaunted independence of the Bank of England. He became a parrot for David Cameron and his Chancellor, George Osborne. And he was the inventor of Project Fear, and he tried to terrorize the British public into thinking that the grass would grow in the streets of the City of London right in front of the Bank of England if it left Europe. And the fact is it's done better than Europe has since it's left, even though it's had a series, unprecedented in their history, of 5 incompetent, failed prime ministers in 8 years. Britain never had that before in all the history of that office, going back to Walpole in the 18th century.
I'd like to ask you, as a guy who's originally from the province of Quebec, what you make of the current situation where the forces of separatism in the province of Alberta are significantly higher than those in the province of Quebec. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an economic rather than a cultural phenomenon, as you know, so there are different types of separatist sentiments. But I find myself, let me put it this way, I understood and never ridiculed the idea of the independence of Quebec. I always understood French Canadians had it in their minds that ultimately they'd like to have their own country. That's understandable. I think a greater vision is a bicultural country. It's a much larger country. In the case of Alberta, they have been discriminated against, and there has effectively been a war conducted against their principal industry. And I think the present premier there, Danielle Smith, is our best, most capable politician in the country right now. And she is not putting herself at the head of one faction or another in the upcoming referendum she's promised. So she's positioned to be the head of Alberta, whether it's a province or a country. But I think we should all understand that they have a legitimate grievance, and it has to be addressed. Look, nobody likes air pollution or water pollution or any pollution, but on the other hand, it is potentially by far our greatest industry, and we're handicapping ourselves as well as particularly punishing Alberta and Saskatchewan by not maximizing our ability as a country to profit from the petroleum industry. And if Alberta seceded, their objective would not really be to set up the Republic of Alberta or the Dominion of Alberta or what realm of Alberta. They would move quickly into the U.S. and this country really would fall apart. So we'd better know what we're dealing with here. So if Quebec pulled out, it's a French country, and you could do something with what's left. But if Alberta pulls out, the whole thing is coming down.
In your view, then, what does the current Prime Minister need to do to ensure that Alberta doesn't want to leave?
Build the pipelines. Give a better tax treatment to the industry, oil and gas industry, and those tempted to invest in it. And, being extremely vigilant on environmental matters and doing the necessary to make sure we have high environmental standards.
Let me just check and make sure I heard you properly, because to my knowledge, she hasn't promised to have a referendum on this. She's promised to lower the threshold by which a citizen's initiative can come forward to have a referendum on this. I think those are different things.
Yeah, I may have misdescribed it, and I accept your correction.
Okay,
but I think you can see where she's headed here.
Well, she's got a faction of her party that, let's put it this way. She doesn't want to get Jason Kennedy, right? So
yeah, and that's a good, I don't know disrespect to Jason, who's a friend of mine also, but that's it, but I don't think that's the whole explanation. I think we're all unlicensed psychiatrists, particularly where politicians are involved, but I think she not only doesn't want to find herself riding 2 horses at once and falling between them, she also, as an Albertan, feels that it's time to raise the ante rather than, as Albertans feel, with some reason they have been a kind of a doormat for Ottawans paying no attention to, in their case, legitimate regional ambitions, which are, by the way, legitimate national ambitions. Everyone in Canada should want us to make, as a country, as much as we can out of our oil and gas resources.
Let me follow up on something you just said a moment ago, which is you thought she is the best premier of the 13 in the country today. And I'm curious as to why you don't have Doug Ford at the top of your list.
What I think I said was the best politician we have in the country, which didn't exclude Ottawa.
Oh, okay.
Because look, again, Doug's a friend of mine too. And there used to be a time, Stephen, when I first knew you, and I knew all the premiers, and I literally knew them all. But you've now mentioned an absolute majority of the ones I do know. But I think Doug is not as fast on his feet or as imaginative as she is, and he's not in the firing line the way she is. I mean,
3 straight majorities, steel and auto under massive tariffs?
I told him he's the FDR of Canada. I mean, toute proportion gardée, you know.
Not yet, not yet.
No, he hasn't got his 4 terms.
Yet.
No.
Yeah.
No, but you know, no one else but Roosevelt had 3 terms. But his technique is different. He's a subtler and less. I want to be careful here. This is not a pejorative thing, but his leadership style is different. Danielle sort of gets out in front of the pack a bit more than Doug does. But I knew the mayor too, Rob Ford, very well, and despite the problems he had, I always admired him as a mayor. He cared about the people. He returned every phone message he ever got, which is an astonishing feat for you in a job like that. No, I'm pro the Fords, but I think right now she's more on the firing line, and I think she's managing it extremely skillfully.
She may have cost Pierre Poilievre the prime ministership. Do you accept that as a thesis?
I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought actually Doug did more to do that. But look, I think it was Trump who cost Pierre the headship of the government. And he didn't mean to do it, but you know, the United States is like a great beast, which, what did Pierre Trudeau say? It's like sleeping with an elephant or something. I mean, it twitches a bit. Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, Donald Trump couldn't care less who the Prime Minister of Canada is, and he doesn't spend 5 minutes a week thinking about Canada. I mean, he likes it, but he doesn't think about it very much. And he didn't mean to influence the election. He didn't particularly think he was.
He sure did.
He surely did.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's, by the way, not a flattering comment on the maturity of our voters or our politicians. I mean, Carney, all's fair in politics, and he won the election doing it, so I'm not knocking him. But this business of his about, virtually standing in the Ontario shore of Lake Ontario, shaking his fist at the Americans as they tried to cross. We'll fight in the beaches and the hills and streets and so on. This Churchillian thing of the Trump is trying to break. This is all nonsense. It really disappointed me as a citizen that anybody took this foolishness seriously.
One more question on Doug Ford.
Fire when ready.
I wouldn't have thought that he would have been your kind of conservative. Is he?
No, but I'm not under. He isn't. But I understand their political party in a large jurisdiction is a pretty big tent. So I'm not intolerant of other factions.
No, but if you had your way, what would you have him do that he's not doing?
I'm a little reluctant to get into criticizing these guys. I think in general he's doing a good job, but I think he's an indistinct conservative. I think he could do more incentivizing the economy, though he's done, I think, very well in job creation. I admire the fight he's putting up to maintain the auto industry, and I think he's going to have to perhaps take more drastic measures to succeed in that. Look, my kind of conservative is a little more the person who goes out and sells conservatism the way Reagan and Thatcher did, and in a way Pierre did. And in Pierre's case, he sold it as greater liberty to the individual. No, I'm not harsh. I'm not heartless. I'm not cutting benefit to needy people or anything like that. I'm promising greater liberty for you with the money you earn. And one of the problems we've had politically in this country is we don't have a real conservative party. Except for Harper, we haven't had one since Robert Borden federally. And we got into this business of the Liberals winning 4 or 5 elections in a row, and then they would lose one, and then, basically because of their hold on Quebec. Now, Mulroney ended that, but we've still had these conservative leaders who essentially say, I'll do the same thing as the Liberals, only I'll do it better. Well, if people want Liberals, they'll get real Liberals and not pretend ones. And by the way, I've often supported the Liberal Party. I'm not hostile to it. It's by far the most successful political party in any large democracy in the last, since the start of the Laurier era, end of the 19th century. But I like conservatives who actually sell conservatism the way Reagan and Thatcher did. Again, this is a different country and a smaller country, but that's not what Doug does. That's not his method. It's a populist thing, which is fine, but it's not actually saying this is why we're different.
Is Donald Trump a conservative?
Yeah, populist conservative, yes, but
loves debt and
only
deficit.
in certain areas. He's a low tax man, certainly.
But he's a high debt and deficit guy.
Well, he's a person who sincerely believes you can cut the deficit on a variation of the Art-Laffer curve. You can use economic growth, but you've got to be genuine about it and not just make trivial gestures. As an economic conservative on the tax side, yes, and it remains to be seen if his idea of how to cut the deficit will work. But look, the fact is when Lyndon Johnson cut taxes, and even when Ronald Reagan cut taxes, eventually they, quite promptly in Johnson's case, and eventually in Reagan's case, the deficit did come down. So we've got to give Donald a chance before we say that he is actually a tolerator of deficits. On social matters, he's become one, I would say, somewhat socially conservative.
Do you believe him? I mean, when he says he's pro-life, you don't really believe he's pro-life, right?
No, I think he is, yeah. I mean, I don't think he's opposed to, I think his views are similar to mine. I mean, I'm not enthused about abortion, but they will happen, and those that happen should be unstigmatizing, and they should certainly be conducted in a proper medical fashion.
That is not the view he advances these days.
I disagree. I think that those are his views. He's not trying to abolish abortion. He's giving it to the states to decide.
Do you ever wish he would behave better?
Yes, I do.
Have you told him that?
Yeah, he asked my advice. Look, he does ask my advice, and he doesn't always follow it by any means, but he asked what advice I had for him to sort of maintain the dignity of the office. And I said, why don't you look at some newsreels? Just get your staff to string together an hour of newsreels, different situations of Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. I mean, at a certain point, if you've reached the greatest office in the world, and the fact of occupying the office is a huge asset, but you've got to maintain the dignity of the office. That doesn't mean you have to do without a sense of humor. He authentically does have a terrific sense of humor. He's very amusing. He's even more amusing in person than he is publicly.
Do you ever find yourself, though, watching him on television, and when he gets into a real weave, thinking to yourself, Donald, stop being such a bloviating horse's ass and just act more normally, please? You're kind of abusing the dignity of the office. Do you ever find yourself thinking that?
I do. Fortunately, much less now than I did in his first term. But yes, I do. The way I say it to my wife is, can you imagine Roosevelt or Eisenhower talking like this? I mean, at some point, God damn it, you're the president, As Roosevelt said, the head of the American people, and you have to act like it. But with that said, like you or me or anyone else, the longer you do the job, the better you get at it. And he's much better than he was.
I would like to ask you about you. Because,
well, that won't take long.
Well, it might. You never know. Because you've had truly one of the most fascinating lives of anybody who's ever lived in this country. You have run big companies. You have met important world leaders. You have made lots of money. You have written many fabulous books. And most famously, unlike, I would say, 99.9% of our guests here, you were a guest of the American taxpayer, as you like to refer to it. You did some time. We talked about that on this program 12 years ago during another one of your visits. Sheldon, the clip, if you would.
I went through a very humiliating experience, being fired from the business that I built with my associates, and indicted and convicted and sent to prison, released and then sent back to prison. But
the Bureau of Prisons and the federal court in Chicago said I was an exemplary prisoner, commended me for what I did when I was there. I did the best I could. I've done the best I could throughout this thing. And I believe that there is some likely reason, insusceptible to my discovery of it, though it is, for such a downfall as I suffered to have occurred. And I accept that, if I may say so, in a completely humble way. I mean, it's an accident of life.
I followed up on that interview asking you why. Why the downfall? What possible reason would there have been that was sort of more metaphysical, if you like? And I asked you, what do you think's going on here? And you said, no, it's too soon for me to weigh in on this yet. So I'm hoping, given that we're 12 years since that last interview, you may have a better sense and be prepared to discuss what happened there.
Well, we are, as you are, we're getting into religious matters here.
Yeah.
And I'm in that tradition, tends to consider that to be a private matter. But I would, it's a fair question, so let me see if I can address it. I would not qualify as a fervent or pious person, but I do believe that there is a divine intelligence that up to a point can be propitiated, and it's certainly worth a try. And believing that it does enhance a person, in this case my own, confidence that, indiscernible though it often is, there is a purpose to otherwise inexplicable things, even horrible things like a plane crash or something. And if you were asking me if I have a better idea of what the purpose is, the answer is no, because since I accept that, let me put it this way, I came to the conclusion many years ago that I had been mistaken in thinking there were no spiritual forces in the world, and there was nothing other than what we see. I believe that's a mistake, and I believe it's harder to embrace that than it is some form of belief in the contrary view. That being the case, I would regard it as kind of presumption on my part to say what the purpose is, but I can go this far. I actually feel that, and if I can say this without being morally self-important, that in some ways I became a more substantial person as a result of it. It was a great challenge, and it was, I don't want to be histrionic, but it was extremely difficult at times, but I got through it, and my wife and my family got through it. And all in all, I feel I did my best with a bad hand of cards I was dealt. On the question of the guilt or innocence by which it came to happen that downfall occurred, that I think is generally recognized now to be nonsense. The U.S. government has effectively apologized for it, and the official position of the U.S. government is that those charges should never have been laid. And the statute under which that I was convicted was by a unanimous Supreme Court with only one recusal, and the judgment written by Madam Justice Ginsburg, who was a liberal judge, found the law ultra vires to the United States Congress and unconstitutional.
Beyond the powers of the Congress.
And unconstitutional. Yeah. I mean, unconstitutional itself in any case beyond the powers of the Congress.
And you got a presidential pardon as well.
I did. So and in the U.S. system, you have my authority for this is the president who gave the pardon. On advice of his counsel, after extensive discussion with Alan Dershowitz, who was acting for me, and you have a pardon of mercy where there's no comment on the verdict. It's just enough is enough. Let this person, let's let him get on with his life. Or you have a power of expungement where you actually say this was an injustice, and that's what I have.
By every normal measure, you are a wealthy man, but you don't have the wealth you once had, and I wonder if you regret that.
I do, yeah, I do, and I'm working hard to make more money.
What are you doing to make more money?
Well, I'm an investor and a financier, but I stay generally out of public companies.
Do your books make you money?
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean, unless you're J.K. Rowling or Tom Wolfe or something. You're not going to live well on what you make as an author.
You look like you've still got lots of gas in the tank.
Oh, I'm in fighting trim. I'm all ready to go. And one of the many things I learned from my father is it is a mistake simply to retire. I mean, he was a very successful man. He retired at the age of 47, and he essentially died of boredom prematurely in his 60s. And change occupations, even involuntarily sometimes, but don't just don't just sit in the rocking chair and start rocking. I mean, if that's your occupation, you're not going to do it for long.
You're clearly never bored. Are you happy, though?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. I wasn't always, but I'm quite happy. Thanks. Yeah.
Good. Well, we're very happy whenever you show up in the studio and accept our invitations to be here. We've had many great conversations over the years.
Indeed, Steve, and although we don't agree on all public policy matters, you've been a good friend, and thank you for having me.
Not at all. It's been our pleasure.
Pleasure's mine.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, June the 4th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, Remember Transit City? We'll look back at the plan to develop public transportation in Ontario's capital city. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.